So, Brian, go ahead and, well, the talk itself is an introduction to the
The
workshop.
workshop.
So, I don't know how to ask you to introduce the talk.
Well, the talk is an introduction to a workshop, so it's a meta intro.
Yeah. What do you want to say about any of this stuff before the talk begins? Is there anything that you left?
Just hope that everyone enjoys it, and I'm kind of trying to reach multiple different audiences here, right? So,
Mhm.
on one hand, I do want to find the people for whom writing something like this would be a little bit of a stretch. Maybe they've learned a little bit of Python. Maybe they've coded one or two somewhat complex programs in the past and are now looking for the next step up in terms of challenge. But thinking about something that Walter said earlier about how we just need more videos out there on D and live coding sessions, or just you're writing a project, so turn the webcam on and start doing. Hopefully, a little bit of encouragement of that, right? I just took the plunge and did it. I know Adam also always takes the plunge and does it as well. Much appreciated. But also, one of the goals here is maybe us being reflexive and saying, yes, D is a very, or can be a very complicated language that can do lots of things. That's one of the things I like so much about D, is how it's incredibly expressive. There's almost always more than one way to say the same thing in D, and it's multi paradigm and all these other things. But could we focus down maybe the way that we introduce D to new people, and think about what core features we can really sell that make D interesting to someone who might either be new to coding or just new to D, and those might be different things depending on the audience. So I'm kind of thinking in terms of the newbies in the coding world. What things exist in D that may or may not exist elsewhere that would be good for us to show off, and kind of good to bring in those new people and get them excited about everything else that D has to offer.
Steve says, yes, 100% agreed. I just talked about that. He and I were just chatting about
Mhm.
that in the last hour. The first thing I want to talk about is I was extremely happy the minute I saw your video submission for the talk, because I have been thinking, I'd like to do something on day two. We've had the live coding session now on day one. For this is the third time we've done it, all three editions of DConf Online. And I've been, what can we do on day two? What can we do that could round out the conference and, just balance that last little hour and a half or whatever. And I just couldn't come up with anything. And then I saw your pitch for a workshop and I'm like, hell yeah, that is it. So how long has this been on your mind?
For a while, ever since I made that series of blog posts.
Right.
So, like I say in the talk, when I kind of first discovered D and finished all the porting to OpenBSD, I thought to myself, "All right, let's try this out." I like assemblers; they're a thing that I can code up pretty quickly, and kind of forces you to experiment and play around with lots of different pieces of the language. And kind of, as I think someone mentioned, it was either earlier today or it was yesterday, about the difference between being a blog guy and a video guy, and maybe that's a generational difference.
Mhm.
But I had lots of people reach out to me saying, could you please turn this into a video? I would definitely watch it.
Mhm.
And the inspiration actually came from BSD conferences. So workshops are incredibly common throughout the BSD conferences, and I've done a couple there as well. So I've kind of hopefully refined the format a little bit and figured, well, I haven't seen any of those at a D conference, so let's try it.
You mentioned a few minutes ago that this is for a varied audience, and I'll tell you right now, I'm in that audience because I have read compiler books and whatever. I've never actually sat down to implement anything. And this was like a really good project. And I kind of had to catch myself a few times when I was in the editor editing your videos. I had to stop myself from watching them long enough to edit them. So I'm thinking I'm going to work through this if I have the time to do it. I didn't read the blog posts. I remember you announcing them in the forums. You did announce them in the forums. I
Hmm.
remember that, but I didn't read them at the time. The video makes it just look so easy. And
Well, I hope so. The magic was a little different than I had anticipated when I started actually doing the recording. I
mhm.
have a big television right in front of me. So I had a pre-written version up on the TV,
Uh-huh.
and you can probably see in the video I keep looking up because I'm looking at my own code, right, to help me both not make mistakes, which of course I did during the workshop, but also to make sure that I covered everything I wanted to cover.
Do you teach this topic at all? Have you done?
So I don't teach compilers or assemblers.
Mhm.
I teach mostly cybersecurity
Okay.
and web development. But in my cybersecurity courses, I do teach a red teaming course. So I teach a whole course on pretty much everything from reverse engineering through to shell coding through to and including ROP chain attacks. So I do have a lot of experience teaching students when it comes to assembly, because a lot of the stuff we do in that red teaming course is you have to be able to reverse engineer and read through the assembly of binaries to find their exploits and to then actually perform those exploits.
Your selection of the 8080 instruction set, how much of that was nostalgia and how much of it
Mhm.
was practicality?
So it's a little of both. So the 8080 and the Zilog Z80, so they technically have different syntaxes for their assembly, but they're binary compatible. And that was a purposeful design choice of the Z80 people. The Z80 came after the 8080 and was kind of an enhanced clone of the 8080. So the idea is anything that you had previously assembled with an 8080 assembler, you can just move over to a Z80 and it will just run. Yes, the Z80 has more instructions, but it will just run. You can actually still purchase Z80s brand new from the factory. The Z80 is actually still in production, even in 2022, something like 50 or so years after it was first released,
Mm.
which I think is really cool. But the reason for the 8080 syntax in particular is because it is easier to parse through. The 8080 syntax is much more regular. The Z80 has lots of parentheses, and that's how you do things like dereferencing. And you kind of have to parse through a line, see if you have parentheses, see what's inside those parentheses. And you have none of that in the 8080 syntax. So it just makes for a much more simplified parser. And you still get an assembler that will work on a CPU that you can still buy brand new from the factory in 2022. So there's a little bit of nostalgia, a little bit of like this is a real thing you can do on a real machine that you can still build today.
Was there ever a period in your post Z80 times when you were writing assembly regularly or reading assembly regularly?
Well, reading, yes, because I, like I mentioned,
Well,
teach
before,
courses where, but no, the assembly was just something that after I started teaching, it's just that I just thought it was a neat project. I've always liked compilers, assemblers, linkers. I've always enjoyed coding in places where I probably shouldn't have been coding. When I was in high school, I remember not ever paying attention to my physics course, but I did code an entire RPG engine in
Mhm.
TI 83 Basic.
Oh my God.
And part of that was really being fascinated in how I could make the machine be reflexive, right? Have the machine program itself in the creation of that game engine. So I think I've always just been interested in languages, and I've always been interested in the different programs that can take human readable source code and turn into machine code. And I know from experience, lots of people think that that's some mystery black box that's really, really complicated. It doesn't need to be that complicated. It can be, but it doesn't need to be.
Yeah. You mentioned in, I think it was the talk, or it might have been the workshop video, but I think it was the talk. You mentioned that the implementation that you did for the workshop is different somehow from the one you did for the blog.
Yeah, so the blog's implementation has no object oriented coding whatsoever. And while there's no inheritance or anything fancy with any of the objects, I did want to make a point to try to showcase as many different pieces of D that will probably be graspable even for newer coders as I could.
Mhm.
So I made it a point to make an object that represented the input source code, another object that represented the output binary. And then I have a third object which the parser will put make into tokens, and the object stores all the tokens and then does action based on what tokens you have.
You said in the workshop video, you're not concerned at all about performance right now and about optimizing. Are you just going to leave it alone after this, or do you have any ideas to optimize further on down the road?
Depends on how busy I get with everything else.
Right.
um, right, but right, the key here really was about proving that these things are not as complicated as, I guess, the mythos surrounding them makes them seem.
Yeah.
Right? I say I forget if it's in the intro video or in the workshop itself.
See, you're just as confused
There
as I am.
yeah.
Yeah.
I recorded them all, and you tend
At
to
the same
forget
time. Yeah.
where you said what. I have
Yeah.
this same problem in my lectures too. Students will come up to me and said, "Well, you said this," and I'm sure I did, but I don't remember what day I said it, but I'm
Mm,
sure I said it. So this assembler is never going to win any awards for efficiency,
right.
but it does work, and it does work correctly. If you feed it assembly code, it will give you back the correct binary code. One of the things I do just for sake of ease of implementation is, right, most assemblers traditionally are two-pass assemblers, and this one's also a two-pass assembler. And I explain kind of the reasons why the two passes are kind of the traditional way of implementing assemblers in the workshop. But I also say to myself, well, if I'm successful in parsing the source code through the first pass, then I must be successful in parsing the source code through the second pass, because I'm never going to change the source code. So I never bother to save anything except for the symbols that I need to actually do the second pass. Right? I don't do any work trying to save any tokens. I don't do any work trying to remember anything I did other than the labels and their addresses.
Mhm.
Because if you can parse it once, you can parse it twice, and that's going to help reduce the complexity. And then if someone later on wants to go back and say, okay, well, we can save a whole lot of time by not actually parsing it twice, parsing it once, saving all the tokens, and then just iterating over those in the second pass, then I would say that's a worthwhile goal to achieve kind of as the next step for them in their coding journey.
When you were learning to program, I'm sure I'm older than you, but I mean, what era were you learning to program in?
So I was a child of the late 80s and the 90s,
Okay.
but I went to a school that must have thought computers were going to be a one-time thing, because they bought a fleet of Apple IIe's. And when I left elementary school in, well, I'm going to date myself, 1998, they were still using the Apple IIe's.
Yes.
So that's kind of my first interaction with computers, were those Apple IIe's that were at my elementary school.
What kind of projects did you make when you first started programming? What kind of projects grabbed your interest early on?
Yeah, so I was entirely self-taught until I was well into adulthood,
Uh-huh.
actually well into college. It was mostly gaming.
Right.
I thought to myself, how could I distract myself? As I'm sure lots of teenage boys did back then. One of the first things I did gaming wise was, and again, I'll date myself here. There was one of the first MMORPGs, Ultima Online. I was a big player of Ultima Online. And my friends and we had our own private server. And
A
I
shard.
remember, yes, a shard. Oh God. And I remember getting my own setup on my own laptop and playing with all the source code and the configuration files to be able to do things that you couldn't do in the actual official game. And then that turned into, well, could I make a whole game from scratch, in which I kind of lost my whole high school physics education to. And then from there, I kind of got swept into operating systems. I became very interested in, well, how does the hardware actually do anything, right? I can worry about the high level stuff later. I became very interested in, well, how does the hardware actually do anything? And then I got swept into the operating system world.
I guess the technical term is free shard. So, yeah.
Yeah, the ones you did not have to pay whatever the monthly
Yeah.
subscription rate was back in the day.
The Run UO, that was the big one for a
Yeah, that
while.
was one.
Yeah.
There was Sphere, I think, was another
Yes.
one.
Yes, I remember that one. Yeah, I was curious because we were talking earlier. I was talking with Mike about how, I think back in the day, people didn't always have the computer background when they got into their CS courses. But today, you can pretty much expect everybody's got the background to some degree. They've learned some kind of programming in one form or another. How do you find it is with your students? Do they all have solid backgrounds in
Oh yeah, no,
programming?
my students can run circles around me in the coding space pretty quickly. But they also grew up with it in a way that I don't think we necessarily did.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's the thing. Yeah.
that was the other thing. And right, and there's a lot more, right? Particularly thinking about my cybersecurity courses, there's a lot more to what I actually do and work on than coding and the coding side of things. So I think while they think they can run circles around me, the truth of the matter is I've also run those very same circles and I do know what they're up to. But I have always been very proud of just how good they are, not just when they come in, but how hungry they are to get better and how much better they all get in, the very short time period of a semester.
Mhm. Ricky has a early question here. He says, I really love the idea of making workshops. Oh, it's questions for me, actually. Making workshops commonplace going forward. Mike, can we make that happen at both online and in person? Yeah. So this was something I was planning to address during this session. I think it's a great idea to do this. And, I said earlier, I was looking for something that we could do on the second day of DConf Online. And I think this is a perfect format for it. So I absolutely want to see this going forward. I think we've got Adam locked into the live coding thing. I think people will have to fight him to take his place on that. He doesn't come to me, by the way. I go to him and I say, Adam, can you please come and do the live coding session? He says, I'll think about it, and that means yes. So I think I'm going to go to you first next year for the online workshop.
That's fair. I'll say this. I will be happy to do more workshops, but I also want to see other people put me out of business.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Right? Because it's one thing if I do them every year, and I'd be happy to do them every year,
Mm-hmm.
but everyone else is going to have different projects that they find interesting, different ways of approaching how do you code these things,
Mm-hmm.
and different takeaways, right? Because my goal with this workshop was, could we get everyone to walk away from this conference with an actual tangible program in D?
Mm-hmm.
And while I might be interested in assemblers and linkers and compilers, you or anyone watching might be interested in other stuff that would be an even more enticing thing to walk away from a conference with. So by all means, feel free to put me out of my misery.
Yeah, so I'll be looking for people to do workshops in the future if we can get them. But as far as in-person workshops, I don't know how that would work for us because that's probably going to require separate space from the conference room, and there's I mean that's going to be something we'd have to work out with Symmetry and or whoever is hosting us in the future. So it's something I'd like to consider, but I don't think it's something we could. We'd have to put a lot of thought into it, I think. So I'll go ahead and ask Mike's question while you're answering that. I'll try to rewind. Great introduction. Have you incorporated D in any of your university teaching?
So that's a really good question. So in the formal classes, no, although I do teach a web science course every spring, so actually coming up in the next semester. Because of some new initiatives we've been doing at RPI, I actually found myself with an extra day that I didn't plan on having and have not had in semesters past. So I was thinking of doing a interesting other things that exist in the world of web science and maybe demoing Vibe or something like that, which is one of D's network and web handling libraries. But I do use D in research, like I kind of mentioned at the very end. So I do have a kind of a multi-compiler project coming up with a bunch of students next semester, and DMD will be part of the mix. So looking forward to having students come in future DConfs and tell you all about their research they've been doing using D.
Adam says, have you seen the Ben Eater videos on YouTube? I found myself asking how the hardware actually did a few specific things recently, instruction decoding in particular, and those actually demystified it.
Yes, I have seen those. I'm sure his video series was one of the kind of in the back of my mind inspirations for this workshop. I think they're great. Both his breadboard video, which I think is based on a book, and then he also has his, was it 6502 series of videos as well. Both are great. Both series are great.
Ricky has a question here. Perhaps a project for your students could be to refactor DMD BE. Or did you mean the BE, the backend? You didn't mean FE, and contribute documentation?
Yeah, so documentation is always a good thing. Well, I don't know how much I should spoil my future research, but I
Uh-oh.
will say that we will be looking into DMD's code generator and seeing if there are potential security things that can be exploited through the code that DMD generates.
Oh.
So there might be some back-end work being done over the next couple of months.
Walter, that would be fun. I,
Good.
I,
I'm glad you think so, Walter.
yeah. He says, though, I'm not sure how that could be a security issue.
Because if the code generator issues instructions that are easy to exploit ROP gadgets, then libraries built with D can have ROP chains built against them, which would require some refactoring and rethinking of what instructions are generated. For example, that's just one example.
So I want to get back to the workshop. I assume you developed the whole assembler beforehand,
Yes,
but it looked like you changed some things midstream while you're recording.
probably.
Okay, so was this like a boring task for you implementing this assembler since you've already done it before, even though you were different?
Boring? No.
Okay.
Right. Everything is a new challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And again, I was really challenging myself to show off as many beginner friendly pieces of D as I could fit
Mm-hmm.
into to that assembler. Kind of where the changes came in were, I had the finished product in front of me, and in
Mm-hmm.
my head I'm thinking, well, I can't do that part until later on. So one thing that I almost kind of flubbed on was having the parser do string handling before we ever talked about the DB instruction. So I actually had to kind of remind myself mid recording, don't copy this part. Pretend that part's not there.
Mm-hmm.
Do the everything else part. And then at the very end, we'll go back and talk about string handling. So any kind of seeming changes were either something that was probably either too complex in the original assembler and wasn't needed, or reminding myself kind of in real time, oh yes, I should hold off talking about that thing until we actually introduce the part where that thing becomes relevant.
Well, hopefully I didn't introduce any errors when I was editing because I didn't have time to review the edits. But
Me too. I'm convinced I for at least one of the parts I gave the wrong episode number,
oh,
but
I
I
didn't
don't think
catch it if you did.
I don't think that's the case, but I tried really hard to make sure that I always began every video with what part it was,
Right.
and I think I did it in order from 1 to 15.
I'm pretty sure you did.
Okay.
I don't remember hearing that. I mean, I
Well,
saw a couple of places where you uh, backtracked or repeated yourself a few times so that I just, I edited out, cut things down, trim things down. But I'm just hoping, sometimes when I get into the zone, when I'm doing my edits, I sometimes get a little too far into the zone and make the wrong key presses. And yeah, I usually always catch it and get I do the undo uh, before it goes. But hopefully I didn't do anything like that this time. Yeah. DMD ARM would be nice, says Steve.
yeah, DMD ARM64 would be nice. I agree. In the back of my head, I have thought about if we could set up DMD to output code for the QBE backend,
Mm-hmm.
which is a tiny little backend written in C, which can output x86 64, ARM 64, and RISC v64. I don't know exactly how I would do that. I'd have to look more in the backend. If I had an infinite amount of time and no job to have to do, that would be one of the things I'd look into doing.
Mm. Walter says it would be great to have another who could do major work on the back end. How many hours a week do you teach?
So I teach a 3-3 schedule. So it's, what is that? That's 12 hours in the classroom a week, plus office hours, plus research, plus everything else I do on campus.
So you spend the better part of your days on the campus then?
Oh yeah, no, I'm there every day. I'm always busy doing something. And if it's not directly class related, it's probably research related or any of the other number of job duties that I have on campus. But keeps life interesting.
I guess you enjoy teaching quite a bit to keep doing it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I enjoy the student, right? They make it fun. They really do. And I know some of them are going to watch this and then tell me that they heard me say this. So I guess I'll have to deny it when they say that to me, that they've watched this. But no, I mean they do. They genuinely make the job exciting and interesting and fun.
Hmm.
I tell people all the time that being a college professor can be tough. Like any job can be tough. And it sure takes a long bit of your life before you're considered qualified to do it,
Mhm, mhm.
right? In my case, getting a PhD. But, I wake up every day and I get to go have fun and teach the people who are going to do everything I do better than I could ever dream of doing it. And so I know I'm going to put that little sliver of the world in good hands, when my time is up.
Walter asks, what's your PhD in?
So my PhD is in actually a discipline in the social sciences and humanities called Science and Technology Studies, which focuses on kind of the social development and social issues surrounding science and tech. And my particular specialty is in tech.
Walter says it sounds fun. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is broadly globally popular,
Mhm.
but it's not, it's never going to be as popular as computer science or
Right.
physics or, the ones everyone thinks of off the top of their head immediately.
Mhm.
But it is globally known and popular.
The group I'm associated with at Yenza University that I do all the editing for, they are focused on city revitalization.
Hmm.
And, that's something I didn't even know was a field of study, but I'm always interested to hear about all these different fields of study. People are getting their PhDs. And the amazing part is that people stick with it so long.
It's a war of attrition.
Yeah.
Having done it personally, it's a war of attrition.
Walter asks, have you looked at D's inline assembler?
I did only enough to complain to you one time about if you could implement the GCC extended assembly, and you said it sounded like a good project for somebody else, and I have not gotten around to it after that.
All right. While we're waiting for some more questions, you want to give us some parting thoughts?
Well, I hate to say D is the best language, since I think I've heard that line before.
You might want to
So
check with Robert about trademarks.
So I suppose I'll go with what I said before. Put me out of business. Put me out of my misery when it comes to these workshops. Not that I'm not happy to do them. I'm always happy to do them, but the community will get a lot more out of it and will be much more successful in attracting new people if that's something that gets spread around amongst a larger group of people. And it's really easy to do. The hardest part is sitting down and turning on the camera, as I'm sure Mike can tell you when it came to me and doing this workshop. Coming up with an idea, you probably already have a good idea. You've probably already written, a 500 to 1,000 line utility that you use. So you have the idea. How do you break it down into small, manageable chunks? And then just filming them. So if anyone wants kind of help and advice in making their own workshops, ping me and I'll be happy to help.
All right. So there's not any more questions coming in. So